Wow, welcome back once again to another episode of Who's Who of the Bible. I hope you've been enjoying the time we've been able to spend together, seeing and learning about people's stories and seeing how their stories can change our stories. I believe that as we grasp their stories, we'll see similarities in how our life and their life isn't that different, and how their stories will change our stories. The United States is playing this out right now as the majority culture comes to understand and hear the stories of the minority culture. And my hope and prayer is that as we hear these stories, that the majority culture would be changed by it. And we have this hope because we have an understanding that stories change stories. And today we're going to navigate a new story. We're going to navigate the story of Moses. And Moses is this character in the Old Testament who experiences just the rhythm of God's gracious guiding hand as his life goes from being a refugee child rescued in the house of Pharaoh, who rises to power and then flees into obscurity as a fugitive, only to be used by God to lead God's people in the Exodus from the grips of Pharaoh's control. Moses' life is marked by redemption. And I think Moses' life must have felt similar to the storyline of Mr. Incredible. Because in Pixar's film, The Incredibles, we run into this superhero who used to be this great, well-respected man, but then he was pushed out to the suburbs because he was causing too much destruction, only to come back and save the city. That story beautifully fits Moses' life. Moses' life began in obscurity. The backdrop of Moses' life is the story of Joseph that we talked about earlier. That Joseph's story, he redeems the people of Israel. He strengthens them. They come to live amongst the Egyptians, and the Egyptians and the Israelites are thriving. But Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, is fearing the Israelites because the Israelites are strong and they're multiplying and they're growing. And they feared that if the Israelites joined with any of Egypt's enemies, that in the case of war, the Israelites might overpower them. And so Pharaoh responds by enslaving the Israelites. Yet, even in this attempt to oppress the Israelites, they continue to thrive. And so Pharaoh takes the next step, and he commands all the midwives to kill Hebrew boys as they're born. It's awful. And then as this genocide goes a step further by demanding that not only males who would be born to be killed immediately, but boys, young boys in general, would be thrown into the Nile River to their death. This is what Moses was born into. Moses was born with a death sentence. Moses' mother carries Moses and hides him for 3 months, but when she's no longer able to hide him, they come together with a plan to protect him. They put him into a little thatched floating device, and they put Moses inside of it, and they put him into the river, and Moses goes downstream, and by God's guiding hand, he ends up in that very house of Pharaoh, taken as Pharaoh's daughter's own son. The providence of God allows Moses to be spared death, and rather than death, he's trained in the wisdom of the Egyptians. Acts 7 tells us that Moses was instructed in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he became mighty in word and in deed. This experience that Moses gained through God's guiding hand would equip him to be God's guiding agent in God's mission to lead the children of Israel out of the hands of the Egyptians. But Moses, being adopted, had this sense within his heart, this dissonance that these aren't my people. Those enslaved people are my people. And this compassion starts working within him. In Acts 7:23 tells us that Moses, at the age of 40, he's walking about his people. He goes down to where his people are, and he sees them, and he sees a Hebrew being overcome by an Egyptian taskmaster, being dominated. And Moses strikes the Egyptian taskmaster to death. He kills him, and he buries them in the sand. And the story of Moses killing the man is described as vengeance. And vengeance is an ominous language used in the Bible because it says that vengeance belongs to God, and Moses had taken vengeance into his own hand. And this news of Moses' vengeance starts to circulate, and Pharaoh hears about it, and he feels betrayed. Honestly, understandably so. He feels that there's a traitor in his house. And Moses, hearing that Pharaoh knows, he runs into the same obscurity as a fugitive from which he came as a refugee. And Moses would spend the next 40 years as a shepherd in the fields of Midian. As a shepherd. He was the Uber Eats of shepherding. These weren't even his own sheep he was shepherding. He was a sheep sharer, a ride sharer of the sheep world. He took care of his father-in-law's sheep. I think Moses had just dismissed himself from this possibility that God was ever going to do anything with him again, that Moses had messed up too much, that Moses, his story couldn't be corrected. And often we do similar things. And hopefully it's not that we've murdered somebody and buried them in the sand, but when we mess up, we feel that we've disqualified ourselves from being used by God. But what we see in the life of Moses is just the opposite. God, instead of dismissing Moses, he appoints Moses to be the deliverer of God's people. And Exodus 2 tells us that God had heard the cries of his people, rising up from the Egyptian slavery, and he would overcome them. And Sandra Reichter describes this act of deliverance by saying, in this tremendous act of deliverance, Yahweh proves himself as the Lord of the cosmos by defeating the greatest emperor of the era on his own turf in Egypt. This wasn't an away game. It wasn't a neutral site game. On his own turf, Pharaoh was overcome by God's guiding hand through Moses. And you'd think that when Moses receives this call to go and lead the Exodus, he'd say yes. I mean, there was a burning bush through which he heard God's voice. You'd think something like that would be so certain that, man, this is what I've got to do. God's giving me a second chance. You'd think he'd be excited. But Moses was reluctant at best and rebellious at worst. Moses gives a couple of excuses that I think we can really relate to when God comes to him. He says, I'm not theologically trained. Who am I to answer their hard questions about God? He says, that's just my testimony. They won't relate to it. He says, I'm not talented enough. God, you know that I'm slow to speech. And then he just tells God, just find someone else. And these excuses, this reluctant heart of Moses, this rebellious heart of Moses, would ultimately be used to be the liberator of the Israelites from Egypt. Adam Hamilton helped me to understand how Moses can change our story, how his story informs our story. He says at times all of us feel like making excuses for failing to do what we fear God is calling us to do in our hearts. And I suspect that there's been a moment in your life, as there has been in my life, where we've reacted like Moses. Now, imagine if God had responded to Moses' objections and just said, no problem, Moses, I'll find someone else. You keep tending your father-in-law's sheep, and I'll find someone else. Moses would have missed out on this incredible opportunity to be used by God to deliver God's people from slavery to freedom. Our reality might not be Moses's. We're not overcoming a superpower. But at times, we as Christians are like Moses in that God's calling us to be his instrument of redemption and deliverance. And I've been humbled by embracing Moses' story as my own and seeing where my heart has been reluctant to be used by God, where I've missed moments that might have changed my life, or more importantly, someone else's. And maybe like Moses, you're reluctant to be used by God because you think your testimony might not connect, or that you're not talented enough to communicate the right way, or that you're just so terrified of sharing your faith that you're like, Lord, send someone else, not me. Know that the story of Moses is our story, is that God uses an ordinary person through ordinary ways to do extraordinary things. The wise words of Adam Hamilton help us to conclude by understanding that when God says, "Get going, I'm sending you," like he did with Moses, and often like he does with us, we would do well to say, "Here I am, Lord, send me."